Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our book club together this evening. I have pleasure in introducing Agnes Kaposi, the author of her memoir, Yellow Star, Red Star, which she will be reviewing with us tonight. Agnes, as many of you know, is a Hungarian-born British engineer, educator, author, and Holocaust survivor. The book is a witness's account of life in Hungary before and during the Second World War and under communist rule, as well as her subsequent escape to Britain. So Agnes, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Agnes will be speaking first, and then we'll all be able to ask her all the questions that we want to ask her. Agnes, over to you.
Thank you. I have some slides which I prepared for myself, but I share with you these slides because I have no secrets from you, and Sophie will show them to you. Well, this is me and this is you, or I should put it the other way around, you and me. I have some letters after my name to designate me as an engineer. Maybe have the next slide. The next slide is the book that we are on about, and as you see, I write here. I hope that some of you may have read it, and those that didn't might want to read the book later. The book, the title tells you the story anyway, so I'm not going to say very much about what is happening in the book. I shall instead maybe have the next slide. Tell you why I wrote it, what it's about, what it contains, how it was written. In fact, I'd like to dwell on that a little bit. And I would like to ask you to figure out together with me what use, if any, it has. The next slide, please. I thought afterwards why people write books or poems or a symphony or a letter. And I think that I pride myself thinking that I normally sense when somebody writes sincerely because they have a creative urge, or not sincerely because they write for money or for self-aggrandizement. I wrote quite a number of books, and there they are, some of them at least, because I had a message to convey. But my messages were about research or engineering practice or engineering education. So there wasn't much problem there regarding the subject matter. I was reasonably convinced that at least to some people, what I am writing would be of interest. And then there is another reason, that somebody is sponsored, and quite a lot of great opuses in music and writing are written because somebody asked. Well, I show you the sponsor who prompted me to write this book, and there she is on the next slide, please. May we have the next slide? Mm-hmm. Here is my sponsor, at least when she was very small. She wasn't much older, my granddaughter Tabitha, when she asked me to tell her about what happened to me when I was her age, when I was going to school. In fact, she asked me first when she was about to go to school. And the question was, is school fun? Was school fun for you? Well, I am obliged to try to tell the truth. In any case, in fact, her big sister, Molly, I write about this in the book, told her cousins, Grandma Kaposi always tells the truth because she has no imagination. Well, the truth was that my schooling was not much fun, and I had to tell this to Tabitha. And later on, she asked more questions. What happened during the wartime? Let's have the next slide, please. So her interest was about my life as a child. And since I was it took time for me to write this book. She grew up to be a young adult. So according to the sponsor's requirements, I was writing about my childhood and my youth, and I lost my childhood to the Nazis and my youth to the communists. And that's why the book is entitled what it is. May we have the next slide, please? So the intended content was a personal history, a witness account, the characters of my life, the relationships, my achievements and disappointments, expectations and surprises, great surprises of survival. If I were religious, I would say that those are miraculous survivals, a whole sequence of them. Those who are not religious might think that they are just unlikely coincidences. There are joys and pains and fears and escapes and all of that. And this is what I was trying to write about. But the problem was, let's go to the next slide, that I needed some historical background. Otherwise it made no sense. And I needed to describe the way in which people lived. So there was I trying to write political history and social history to underpin what I was writing, being acutely aware that I am no historian, only an engineer without imagination. So let's have the next slide. I tell you here how this book was written. I had memories. These memories are even nowadays vividly coming forth in pictures, sometimes in my dreams, sometimes when I am awake. And if I would be a better draftsman or a painter, I could depict for you. There's an echo. Can you hear the echo?
No.
You can't. Well, in that case, I shall ignore it. I don't know why there is. Anyhow, I had these vivid memories, and I tried to describe them, but the question was, how valid are they? There are doubts arising. I questioned whether one can rely on memories, and forensically speaking, any lawyer, like one of my daughters is, will tell you that the testimonies are notoriously unreliable, not because the storyteller wants to lie, but because memory is unreliable. And there was I trying to respect the reader, and I had responsibility to tell the truth. In fact, that is the way my father treated me. If you read the book, you will see my father always answered my questions, even if the questions were difficult. And if the subject was not really suitable for a child, like the events of my early childhood, they were not really suitable, but I was asking the questions, and he phrased his answers in a way that the language should be understandable, but he stuck to the truth. And I tried to do the same. So I then questioned, and I give you at least one example, or maybe two in the book, but there are lots of examples of me asking, did it really happen as I remember it? Or did I read something like this? Or did I imagine something? Or did I see a film when dramatic events like these took place? And I now deceive myself to think that they are my memory. So this business of fighting with my own memory reminded me of the scientific method, which is a systematic way of examining circumstances, describing them the best way you can, but forever looking for the next approximation to the truth. The historical method, as I later discovered, is very similar. An honest historian is aware that the truth can only be approximated, and the historian strives for revealing the truth more and more accurately as he or she learns more about it, just like the scientist does. And then there is the next question. Once you have made your description of situations as valid, as truthful as you could, how can you get independent validation? So I hunted for cooperation with historians. And all the time while I was writing this book, nearly a decade, I kept on looking for historians, asking historians for their methods, for their data, to read parts of what I have written, looking for independent validation. And very fortunately, through the good offices of Ben Barkow, the then director of the Wiener Library, I had an introduction to a historian. He is well published, Dr. Chös. He is half my age, but has all the wisdom that belies his relative youth. He was working for me on a different project, on an aspect of my story, which is to do with what happened to the young Jewish men of my life and of the young Hungarian Jewish men altogether. This is the most painful aspect of the Holocaust for me, the loss of my beloved uncles and in fact a generation of young Hungarian Jews. And he was working for me, taking a year's sabbatical from his job, trying to uncover some more information about these lost young Hungarian Jews, when I lumbered him with my manuscript, and out of this arose the historian's voice, which runs alongside the book. In fact, his contribution was not more than about 6 months before the publication of the book, and there was my independent validation. Not always did we agree. If you like, I can give you examples where what I remembered and what he, a historian, has recorded were not at one. And it took us a while, me learning from him an immense amount, and even he learning from me, to see how our differences could be reconciled. Neither of us were trying to be untruthful, and both of us were right. And as I say, there would be examples, if you like, I can give you when we disagreed, and finally we came to a reconciliation. So this is the way the book was written. It was written really quite painfully. I acquired a whole library, several shelves full of books. Some of them I bought. A few of them were generously donated to me by Esther Gilbert and others. So that is the way the book came to being. May I have the next slide, please? There was an afterthought. My friends who have read the manuscript kept on saying, surely there has to be something more to be said. After your youth came early adulthood and then later life, you should write something about this. Well, I was reluctant because my sponsor was not interested. My sponsor was interested in childhood and youth. But in fact, I added a chapter at the end. And now I am thinking about some aspects of my later life. If I can summarize this, having arrived to Britain, all of a sudden I found that there was nobody wanting to kill me anymore. Nobody was trying to report on me, to hire authority. I could trust people. A stranger would not be an enemy, but possibly benevolent. Nobody abused me for being a foreigner or a Jew. But I did have a great deal of conflict and difficulty for being a professional woman, especially in a profession such as mine, which in this country, more than many others, is male-dominated. And I am writing some aspects of my life experience in Britain. Not all is smiley and happy, because there is oppression even to this day. of various people, including professional women. But I don't know whether I shall live long enough for a second edition or a second volume. I don't know what I will do with the writing I do about how to be or how not to be a professional woman in this country. May we have the next slide, please? Well, the next question is, what use is this book? Well, I ask this question not only of myself, but of the books written by Holocaust survivors. Most of them take the approach by historian describes this as, well, there is the Holocaust, and then we survive the Holocaust, we are liberated, and then we live happily ever after. Well, that wasn't my approach. As you see, in my case, after the liberation came another type of tyranny. But you could treat this as a storybook for Tabitha or for anybody else. The next question is, should it serve, does it serve as Holocaust education or education about tyranny in general? And what use, if any, will this book have once I am not around here? Because nowadays the question is asked, has Holocaust education failed already? Well, in that case, it's up to the next generation. Is this book of any use to anyone, the next generation or whoever? That's my introduction to this book. I want to show you the next slide as well. This is the Rogues Gallery -1. These are my grandchildren. The second from the left is Tabitha, aged 21. She is the one who sponsored this book. The next to her on the right is Dylan, a historian, but he is too busy doing his own history degree, finishing this year. The other two are of great support to me. Tabitha's sister, Molly. Those two, the two girls on the picture, are the children of my daughter, Esther. One of you knew Esther at university. Esther died more than 17 years ago. But these two splendid girls are hers, and that is great fortune to me. The one on the right-hand most side is my linguist grandson, Jay, who has things to say about a foreigner like me writing in her second language. I learn from him as I learn from others. There's one more grandchild who refuses to have her picture shown to the public, which is a great pity because she is a real beauty. That's my oldest granddaughter, Ella, who is our teacher. Well, that's me, finished. I'd like to have your questions, your comments, and your advice, whether a book such as this might be useful for any reason at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I would suggest is I invite all of you who want to ask questions to unmute yourself, and we'll just have free conversation. If you're happy to, I'm happy to ask a first question. So the question I've got, Agnes, is to ask you have you been back to Hungary since the time when you escaped, and what are your views on the rise in anti-Semitism that there is there now?
Well, these are two very different questions. I went back to Hungary for several reasons. One, because my beloved grandmother, about whom I write, she's one of the reasons why we survived as a family. She was still alive and I wanted to see her. I didn't go for a long time, and then I did visit her while she was still alive. Then I visited because my research was of interest to my own university. Now, my university is an august institution. It is not only a good institution locally, but it is of the region, and also many of the most important engineers and scientists of the 20th century are alumni of it, including, for example, Dennis Gabor, Nobel laureate, inventor of the hologram, and so on, many of them. Von Neumann, who is, without whom we wouldn't have the computers as we have now. Some of them are atomic scientists and so on. So it's an august, important institution, and I was asked whether I would assist them with research because they were interested in the sort of work I was doing. So there I was. It's an unnerving experience to lecture in your own mother tongue, and I speak the language very well, except I had no technical language left at all because the subject developed and my own work developed here in England. So there was I, speechless in Hungarian. It wasn't an easy situation. And then I also had an assignment on behalf of the British government, a British academic establishment, if you like. I can explain that if you wish. So I did go back several times. As regards what happens now, it's not that the anti-Semitism is rising. It is far worse than that. It is a dictatorship. It's a corrupt dictatorship which dismantles the entire structure, the constitutional law, all the checks and balances of a civilized society. Democracy exists, and populism is such that this dictator, a completely ruthless dictator, is actually popular because this is a country. I must explain this to you. The people of Hungary are talented. My house is full of manifestations of folk art. Hungarian folk music is and Hungarian poetry, my goodness. These are all beautiful things. And yet the very soul of the nation is somehow poisoned. They embraced enthusiastically Nazi philosophy. Under communist rules, the situation was different. Jews and non-Jews were equally oppressed. But during Nazi times, my goodness, they were worse. In fact, Eichmann is reported to have said that the cruelty of the Hungarians is intolerable. Now, this same spirit is promoting populism now. So it's not just anti-Semitism, it's even worse than that. And I try to keep away. One of my cousins, very, very dear to me, is a famous musician, and he would not set foot in the country, and nor would I. My grandmother is dead. Anybody very dear to me is no longer alive. I don't go anymore. It's a dreadful place.
Did many of your family survive or not so?
All the young men, may I tell you a little bit of this bit of the history? It's in the book. It's different. The Hungarian Holocaust is very different from, for example, the Polish one. The Poles were all put into the ghettos. Hungarians were not clamped into ghettos until the spring of 1944. And by then, most of Europe's Jews were dead. The Hungarian young men, on the other hand, were conscripted into the army as soon as Hungary joined the war in 1940-41. And the way they were treated by their fellow men in the same army, their very comrades in the same army, meant that all of the men of my family, with one single exception, and all of the young men who were my parents' friends or colleagues, they were all dead. The whole generation, in my own experience, was murdered. So that part of my family and my environment is just done. And of the rest, about half, just over half, were murdered. and how 11 members of my family survived, including me, is one of the miracles. We were heading for Auschwitz, and had we had our train continued to Auschwitz, I wouldn't be here. I was 11 at the time, and nor would more than half of the 11. 6 of us would have immediately been killed. Why the train was diverted, how it was that we fetched up instead in Austria is part of my story. But that is the way how 11 people survived. But even then, over half of my family was killed.
I'm the one who's been asking questions, but I'll shut up now. Can I please have some questions from anyone else who'd like to ask? Just unmute yourself.
I put up my hand.
Yes, please,
But
speak.
hi, I'm Lisa. I'm in Toronto, Canada, and my background is Hungarian. And Agnes, as soon as I saw your name, I thought, oh, Agineni.
Right. I don't respond to Agi nowadays. Agnes is preferred, but go ahead, please.
So I grew up also knowing that about how awful the Hungarians were, and the anti-Semitism, was terribly afraid to go until about 2 years ago. And I went to Debrecen, and I went to where my family is from, in Nyíregyháza and Mezőkeresztes. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking that you asked before about the importance of something that you have done, that you've written. It is, I'm shaking because it is so important to have this kind of evidence, to have this kind of documentation. I mean, I'm doing tons and tons of research, and afterwards, God willing, I can speak to you about some of the questions that I have in my own research about Eastern Hungary. But there is so little that is written about the experiences of Jews in Eastern Hungary before and during the war. And I think that what you have done is you have opened a door that, especially at this time, with such a rise in anti-Semitism, at least I'm seeing it here in Canada, it's so important to realize the experience of Eastern Hungary, because it wasn't the Nazis that were so horrible, although they were. The Hungarians themselves were considered worse than the Nazis. And, and by Canadian, or I guess any other standard, we have to realize that this can happen with the people around us and with the communities that we're in if we are not more aware. And I mean, in most of the communities and Jewish experiences, it was the Nazis that came in that were horrible. I mean, we know a little bit about France, but there is nothing that compares to how the Hungarians were in Eastern Hungary. And your story is so important to go to universities, to go to high schools, to go into libraries where there's not necessarily, where there may be a Jewish background, because most Jews don't know about the Hungarian Jewish experience in Eastern Hungary, to go into public institutions so that people can realize it, to be reviewed by Goodreads or any other online book review organization, to talk about the experience, because a lot of people, thank God, have had the koyach to write about the inner strength to write about their experiences, but there are not a lot of people from Eastern Hungary that survived. So the fact that you have the
almost nobody,
almost nobody.
Right. Lisa, may I ask you, to be in touch. Send me or send the book group your contact details, and let's talk, because it seems that you are particularly interested and you seem not knowledgeable. I would very much like to have your contribution. I agree with you. Reviews would be important. Some reviews have been done, but more should be. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, I'll give it to Sophie. And
Thank you.
I think, there are some organizations in New York that are taking care of some of the cemeteries in Eastern Hungary now, because there's nobody survived. There are lots of organizations that should see your book.
Thank you very much. May I just add one comment? There were a few survivors, even of the provinces. 15,000 people of the province, no, about 9,000 of the provinces survived. 500,000 were murdered. And that was enough for pogroms after the war to take place in Eastern Hungary. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sandra.
Yes. Hello. Hello, Agnes. I'm Sandra. I went to university with your daughter Esther, so I'm the person.
So I hear.
Well, yeah. So I'm very pleased to meet you. My father was a Holocaust survivor from Budapest.
Really?
He wrote his story. Esther and I remember discussed that back in the day. He wrote his story. He self-published it, and people who've read it have said, it was miraculous that he escaped. But as I say to people, there are no Holocaust survivors, certainly from Hungary and quite possibly from anywhere, who didn't have a miraculous story. If there wasn't a miraculous story, they didn't survive. It's really as simple as that, isn't it? So I still go to Hungary and visit. I have cousins there and I go and see them. I was there a few months before the pandemic started. They're not happy, but they're still there. My question is wider than the question you just had, and you talked about anti-Semitism and the situation in Hungary. It's everywhere, isn't it? The world is in the most dangerous state it's been in, certainly during my lifetime. I think it's critical that you and others write their stories, because figures like 6 million, they don't really mean anything to people, but individual stories and accounts do mean something. So I guess two questions. One, how concerned are you about the state of the world currently? And two, it's wonderful that you've written this, and it's great that people, I haven't read it yet, but I will read it. How do we get the people who need to read it?
Well, the answer to your first question is, I'm afraid, obvious. Of course I am concerned. We are all concerned, and this is a great disappointment, because what we hoped was that when the communist regimes collapsed, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that we were going to have peace. And look at that, look at the situation in which we are. And I am deeply, desperately concerned. And I am, among other things, concerned that those people who are oppressed, instead of sticking together and having some solidarity one to the other, they are in fact fighting among themselves. And that is a great disappointment. The lesson is not learned through suffering. That's as to your first question. And your second question was?
What can we do to get the people who need to read your story and hear your story to read and hear it?
Well, this is a question I ask myself. I as good as adopted a school in a very poor area on the edge of London. This is white working class English. There are no brown faces, no black faces. There is only one Jew in the entire school. When I first was invited to talk to them, I asked them, have you met a Jew before? Put up your hand. There were 180 pupils in front of me, not one hand went up. They never met a Jew. There is no Jew in the staff. Now, it is by chance I got in contact with that school, and that was 6 years ago. And since then, every year I go back to them. They have problems. They have problems of racial intolerance, even in a school where there are no other races other than English working class. This is the very environment where we should penetrate. And I am asking people like the Holocaust Educational Trust, various of the organizations, March of the Living, all of the people that I am in contact with. How do you reach those areas? But Bet Shalom now, Bet Shalom, you know who they are a wonderful organization. They respond, all of these organizations respond to schools, to communities, when they are invited to talk to them, to explain what had happened. And how about the ones that don't get as far as asking the question? Those are the ones we should be reaching, and it is not happening.
Yeah.
And it is a disappointment. That is why what Lisa was saying would be important, to have surveys of books or whatever, to publicize it among the people, among the population who wouldn't otherwise know anything about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, there's another one little bit of detail I want to say. That what happened was, as I mentioned in my book and in my talk, that 500,000 of the provincial Jews, almost 500,000, were killed in Auschwitz, the largest single crowd of people in Auschwitz were the Hungarian Jews, and they were killed when the war was almost over in the summer of 1944. The killing of the Budapest Jews was not completed. So almost nobody survived from the provinces, but half of the Jews of Budapest survived. Any Jew that you come across nowadays is likely to be a descendant of a Hungarian Jews, Budapest Jews. And how it happened that the Budapest massacre didn't get rid of all of them, only half of them, is another story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Esther?
Agnes, could you tell us a little bit about the research you've done or have been doing on the Hungarian Jewish labor groups and what happened? Because you were working on that years ago, and it's a difficult story, but I think it's an important one, and not one that many of us know about or know enough about.
Yes, the whole of the Hungarian Holocaust is not as well known as it might be. It really was a very important Jewish community, although it's a tiny, tiny little country, but it was one of the largest Jewish communities. And other than the Polish and Russian loss of Jews, the loss of Hungarian Jews is by far the largest over the whole of Europe. Now, how this was, how the civilian population was treated is one story. But I already mentioned what happened to the young men. These were conscripted, as I said, at the beginning of the war. Jewish battalions were formed. They were taken to Ukraine because that is where the theater of war at that time was. And they were not primarily killed by the war. They were either killed by typhus because of the circumstances of their lives. So they were either killed by disease, or they were killed by the brutality of the Hungarian guards around them in the same army. Now, even Martin Gilbert writes only a little bit about it. Most people write only a little bit about it because it's a small country and it is a small part of the population. because most of the people who were murdered in Auschwitz were in fact not these men. So numerically speaking, if you like, it's not important enough, except a generation was this way eliminated. An example is what happened to my aunt, who was my mother's younger sister. Her husband died in one of the horror places, Dorosic, perhaps the worst of all, where 800 Hungarian Jews were set to light alive. They had typhus and they were killed there. Two of my uncles were killed there. Well, his wife, my aunt, remarried later, several years after the war, and she married a man almost precisely twice his age, because his family were killed in Auschwitz. So her young husband was dead, his young family was dead, and together they married. And the product is my cousin, who is one of the greatest musicians alive now. But this is a Hungarian story. Now, some things have been written about it. The most information you get from Randolph Braham's books on the Hungarian Holocaust. And he died recently, about a year or so ago. He was, I think he was Romanian-Hungarian, but he was a professor at Princeton. And he wrote two great tomes about the Hungarian Holocaust and some extra work about these people. But research is still continuing. And I sponsored Dr. Churs, who has written, Dr. Churs is the historian who writes A Historian's Voice in my book. And he spent a year on sabbatical. I am not rich, but I paid for a year of his sabbatical, paying for replacing his income, because the sabbatical was unpaid, and also his expenses. And he has written some studies during this time. And fortuitously, actually, he researched the East Hungarian Holocaust. And so not only was he knowledgeable about the thing in general, but about these men and about East Hungary. The work is going on, Esther.
Thank you. Daphne Price, I'm told you have some questions. You're muted and we can't see you. If you can hear me.
Hello. Can you see me? No.
No.
I can see a big screen.
I don't know how. I'm sorry you can't.
There should be
Agnes,
there should be a video button, the bottom left of your screen, perhaps, next to the mute button. You click on that.
video. No.
Hello.
Yes.
Oh yeah, there
Hello.
you
I
are.
can see you.
That is a
Hello,
dear
hello,
friend.
hello. Thank you. Agnes, well, you've written something remarkable. Your story, your life story, I know a lot about it, has been just an incredible miracle, as you've said. And I know you write in your book so lovingly about your own grandmother, Nanuka, I think that's how you pronounce it, who was such a huge influence on your family. You're a dutiful grandmother, and your sponsor, Tabitha, at age 10, started this whole wonderful journey of, right through for another 10 years. Many things come to my mind. Firstly, in writing the book, has it somehow impacted on your relationship with your family? Would it have influenced the paths they've taken or the career choices they made? In your book also, you have an incredible recall of your visual recollections of your childhood life. And I find that quite remarkable, but it might explain that you have a memory which has fed your intellectual success and your path in your career. Perhaps that's all part of that. Coming back to the book, penetrating non-Jewish schools is so vital. could this not somehow be part of the curriculum in history? And could it somehow be presented for younger readers as a story, sanitized, if you like, but as a story of Tabitha asking you to write it, and your wonderful recollections of your own the moments you treasure, as well as the horrors that you experienced?
Well, whether this book helped or shaped my relationship with my grandchildren, I don't know. The book grew up together with my grandchildren. My youngest Daphne knows my whole family. May I say how you know my whole family?
Of course.
Daphne is a dentist and she looked after all of us.
Great pleasure.
I have a picture, unbelievable. Molly, aged about 5 or 6, sitting in a dentist's chair, laughing. And there is a picture of Molly and Daphne together. How many children go to the dentist and sit in the chair laughing? That is Daphne, the dentist.
Tabitha's very special.
Well, so I don't know whether writing this book changed my relationship with my grandchildren. None of them, with the exception of Tabitha, asked me about my personal history. Neither of my children, not even my inquisitive daughter Esther, asked me. And I asked subsequently, Esther is no longer with us, but I asked Anna whether how it was. And did they know, did they learn anything about what happened to me during the wartime? And she said, no, we didn't ask any questions, but it was always in the air. Now, yes. I think that writing this book was always in the air, as it were. I never foisted it upon my grandchildren, or I try not to foist it on anybody. But I do have a fantastic relationship, even if I say so, with my grandchildren. They share with me, for example, their essays in their university life. Yesterday, I had a conversation about politics with one of my grandchildren. For 4 hours, we were debating like 2 adults, and he's my grandson, and we have a relationship where we can talk about matters, things that matter to us both.
That's wonderful.
Whether the book had anything to do with it, I don't know. As regards the recall, I have, it's very difficult. As I keep telling you, I do have most vivid recall.
Yes.
And I keep questioning it. And I describe a situation. May I mention an example of this? I remember that the camp, the first camp where we were, was just under a great big metal tower. And I learned that this was a radio transmitter supplying radio signal for the whole of Vienna. This was just outside Vienna. This is Lower Austria. There are no mountains, but there are small hills. And this is the highest spot. And there was this great big tower, and immediately underneath it was our camp. And I remembered the tower and the camp. Except when I tried to write the book, I couldn't find the tower. It was not there. And I looked at Google map, satellite map, no tower. Well, all right, I remembered wrongly. And I tracked it down, that in fact it had been there, and the Germans exploded that tower in April 1945. So while we were there, the tower was there, the transmitter was working. Now, so you see, I had, in order to find that, I had to look at the history of broadcasting in Austria. Was there a tower? And what happened to it? And I had to look through historical records and so on, just to validate what I was writing. It was difficult.
Yes. You mentioned in your book a very poignant memory of a teacher who ignored you, even though you were one of the star pupils. Just enlarge on that episode.
Well, I can tell you something very nice about this. I don't know whether many of you know about the project Echo Eternal. Esther Gilbert does. This takes place in the schools around in Birmingham. It started in the schools where the Trojan horse scandal was. You remember a few years ago. And they are trying to turn around that whole area. And the schools of inner city Birmingham, at first 12 of them, and now it is growing, spreading out. These 12 schools, one each, studied the testimonies of a survivor. And that was before my book was written, but a testimony had been filmed on my behalf by the Holocaust Memorial people. And so they got hold of the recording and they studied it. And that school actually picked out some aspects that they had found. And they picked upon this particular one. And they made a little film, a 7 or 8 minute film. There's little Agnes in the classroom and the teacher ignoring little Agnes in the classroom. That is, it actually is one of the aspects of the story that appealed to them. I'm quite sure it's child cruelty for a whole year, a teacher ignoring a pupil. I was not one of the stars of the show. I was the star of the show. My father made sure that was the discipline. In my family, this is a joke, that if somebody brings home 95% of the marks, then they have to account for what went wrong. Where did the other 5% go? And that's the way I was brought up. And under those circumstances, the teacher never made eye contact with me, never uttered my name, never talked to me, never asked me a question for a whole year. Yeah. That's child cruelty.
Incredible.
Well,
Thank you.
but she didn't want to kill me. There were lots of people who did.
We're coming up to the sort of hour. Does anyone have any other questions? You've been incredibly kind, incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you all for all of you who have been raising the questions. It's been a privilege for all of us. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
May I ask you, for in the name of what Lisa has been saying, if you find, if you think of any questions or comments, let me know. And if you can bring yourself to write a review anywhere, please do that. And I am saying this without any apology, because any income out of this book goes to charity. I don't financially benefit from it. But if it is of value, if it is to be, if the message is to be spread, then please help me by writing your reviews of it.
Is it possible
Wonderful.
to purchase the books on Amazon?
Yes, you can buy it from Amazon, or you can buy it from March of the Living. If you buy it from March of the Living, I think it costs a bit more, but it goes to charity anyway. And it doesn't matter where you buy it from. I do get royalties, and any royalty I get goes to charity.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
A very good night to everyone.
Thank you.
Until next
Good
time.
night.
Thank you, Agnes.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.
Yeah,
Thank you
bye-bye.
very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Stay
Thank you.